Welcome to the film analysis, today with The Birds by Alfred Hitchcock. Released in 1963, it represents by far the scariest film of Alfred Hitchcock. Even more so, it belongs to the scariest films in the entire history of cinema. The film was enormously technically complex at the time. After all, how does one reasonably produce bird attacks in a studio? You can't keep throwing birds at actors. How is one supposed to direct masses of birds? Hitchcock chose a process that was developed at Disney, including sodium vapor lamps and a yellow screen. The film was cut frequently, and individual pieces were shot and reassembled in the editing room. The post-production was enormously time-consuming, but it was worth it, even if some of the technical aspects no longer seem up to date to us today. The bird scenes still bother us. The ingenious soundtrack also contributes, even though it doesn't include music in the usual sense. Bernard Herrmann didn't compose here, but he did collaborate with Hitchcock. The composer, however, was the electronics pioneer Berlin-based Oskar Sala, having developed an instrument called the Trautonium, a kind of organ simulating bird sounds. Sala layered different tapes over and over again, sampled them, and created a bird sound more threatening than any music played with instruments could be. Many interesting documentaries exist, but we wave goodbye to the technical stuff now and approach the actual obvious question: why do the birds attack? The film complicates its interpretation. You may understand it as a simple horror film, not doing justice to the film. However, we must approach this film in different ways to understand why the birds are attacking. The film begins in San Francisco. We see Melanie, played by Tippi Hedren, walking across the street to a bird shop to pick up a bird she has ordered. It isn't there yet. In the process, she meets Mitch. They vaguely recognize each other from Kurt, but she apparently doesn't really remember. He does remember, but pretends that she, who is an it girl, daughter of a newspaper magnate, is a saleswoman in the store. Thereby, a strange love communication unfolds. Mitch is looking for two sparrows parrots, but some that don't squawk all the time, not too passive either. Think of the double meaning. He wants them for his sister, who is still very young. In fact, both Mitch and Melanie are longing for an erotic desire. Melanie is also immediately interested in him. She inquires about Mitch's address in San Francisco through the editorial office of a newspaper. She cannot find him there. She is told he is always in Bodega Bay on weekends, 60 kilometers from San Francisco. Melanie drives out, takes the sparrow parrots to hand over to Mitch's sister, merely an excuse. She's really after Mitch. She arrives in Bodega Bay, a quiet seaside town. First, she arrives at the post office, inquires about the address, wants to know the sister's name. There are two different opinions in the post office. Afterwards, she heads to the village schoolteacher Annie, telling her the sister's name is Kathy. After that, Melanie travels by motorboat to Mitch's house, puts the sparrow parrots in the cage, and returns to Bodega Bay. The first attack occurs as they meet at Bodega Bay Harbor. A seagull flies down at Melanie and hits her on the head. She bleeds. The unfortunate events begin to unfold. More and more birds attack, and they become more persistent and more deadly. After a dramatic night, after the weekend has passed and the birds almost hacked Melanie to pieces, the group Melanie, Mitch, Kathy, and Mitch's mother, Lydia, leave together. The birds are left behind, all sitting on the patio on the lawn. It's a strange movie. What have we seen? First, a man torn between four women. Mitch's sister, Kathy, an ex-lover, namely the village school teacher Annie, who hints at her feelings towards Mitch to Melanie, the possible new lover Melanie, and the mother Lydia, representing an overbearing mother. There is an absence of the father as he died, but he remains present at the same time in a strange way, namely in the form of a huge portrait in the living room. After the first bird attack, the portrait hangs askew. We witness an Oedipus complex. Schoolteacher Annie denies it. The mother is not afraid of losing Mitch. She's afraid of being alone, but she talks herself out of it strangely, and we should not believe that there is no Oedipus complex here. Moreover, Melanie and Lydia resemble each other. They have similar hairstyles, Lydia being a graying Melanie. But psychoanalysis fails to explain the film, to explain why the birds attack. Hitchcock deals with all sorts of things in the film, with the devil being in the detail. In the very first scene, closely watched, airplane posters hang in the background referring to modern birds, technical progress versus nature. Let's first take a step back. I've already roughly outlined the plot, Melanie's arrival. There are more steps to follow. We learn a lot about the local surroundings. Where is Bodega Bay situated? How does Melanie reach Mitch? Following my pointing finger, says the man in the post office with the camera following suit. There are many directions in this film. How to get to the house of the village school teacher, how to return to the road, how Melanie could still leave in the evening. Hitchcock constantly explains the geography. Later, during a massive bird attack, we gain an even better understanding as the camera films from above. We obtain a very good sense of the village. You create incredible tension with that. You establish an order. That order becomes completely chaotic. Modern films permanently disorient the viewer. In many modern horror films, real tension ceases to exist. We first must know exactly where we are. We must know which exists are available, where we could go. Only then may the catastrophe set in. This is how Hitchcock proceeds. He also works with disorientation at the decisive moment, namely during the bird's final attack on Melanie. Tippi Hedren has told much of her agony during the shoot when the birds enter the attic and really threaten to peck her to pieces. Hitchcock makes use of dismemberment, applying a high editing frequency. He repeats the shower scene from Psycho. At the same time, we have the theme of femininity. Hitchcock plays with two types of women, the blonde Melanie and the brunette Annie. Between them, we witness an underlying tension about sexuality and passion. Annie is still strongly attached to Mitch. She even stays in the village just to be close to him. She says, "I'm not giving up this friendship ever." A little later, a bird crashes into the door, a seagull, and is killed instantly. Annie and Melanie both wonder why. Annie suggests the gull to be lost in the dark. Melanie objects, "It's not that dark, it's a full moon." The two women look at each other meaningfully. The scene is held for quite a while. We might call it a cliffhanger in a soap opera, but it is actually a fermata. We pause and watch. We are supposed to let the scene sink in, catapulting us viewers back into the aesthetics of romance. The birds signify a real threat, which is commonplace. We all see birds all the time, but they prove to be harmless. A good horror film renders the cozy and known uncomfortable. That's exactly the case with the birds. At the same time, they are invincible. Against King Kong or Godzilla, people may defend themselves. Against the birds, we seem powerless and overwhelmed, however. There are just too many of them, many more birds than people. The film's ending is cruel, disturbingly strange. When we leave the cinema, finish the DVD or turn off the TV, the birds stay until the end. We must ask ourselves, do we maybe even hear them laughing? We ask ourselves afterwards, why did they attack? Well, there are 7 reasons. First, ecological ones. Human influence on nature confuses the birds, hence the attacks. Secondly, family. The incestuous instinct breaks through the birds on behalf of Lydia, prevent sex between Melanie and Mitch. Melanie ends up being a weak woman, and only then does her relationship with Lydia improve. Third, it could be a divine punishment, as expressed by the drunk in the restaurant, slurring and constantly quoting the Bible, proclaiming the end of the world. Fourthly, the birds could represent a plague. That would be the rational scientific argumentation, but how did the plague come about? A virus starts somewhere as well. One can explain it to a certain degree. Viruses enter the world, but why does the plague exist? Even natural science does not offer final explanations. Fifth, the film can be read symbolically as a class struggle, the birds representing the caged and oppressed. We do not lock people in cages, but in terrible factories. Now the power of the many rises, the birds of all countries and species unite. Sixth, the film may be understood as a return to war, representing an air raid. This is somewhat hinted at by Daphne du Maurier in her 1952 novel The Birds, which inspired Hitchcock's film. Finally, there remains a peculiar 7th interpretation. When Melanie returns to the restaurant after a catastrophic attack, where everything starts to burn, even in the city, suddenly the women blame her for the birds. Melanie had brought the disaster. A woman is completely beside herself, a familiar discourse from horror films in the 50s. The stranger brings the disaster. Xenophobia resonates. Hitchcock revisits a genre tradition. Controversial literary scholar Camille Paglia has written a fantastic book about the birds, referring to the scene of accusations among other scenes. Quote, "The shrill mother, like a witch baiter in the crucible, advances on Melanie, whose point of view is taken by the camera and therefore us. They say when you got here, the whole thing started. Who are you? Who are you? Where did you come from? I think you are the cause of all this. I think you are evil, evil." Melanie, having had quite enough of impossible mothers, smacks her solidly in the face, which breaks the spell, but there is still no movement to Melanie's side. While the women's charges are too irrational and sensational to accept in naturalistic terms, they have a mythic power that cannot be shaken off. On same level, Melanie really is a kind of vampire attuned to nature's occult messages. End of quote. Camille Paglia doesn't understand Hitchcock's work as a Catholic director's film, but rather something erupts that one might call the mythic pagan power embodied by the birds. Paglia emphasizes sexuality and violence. To Paglia, Melanie embodies a kind of fearsome femininity that is in no way, as lovebirds are supposed to be, too passive. According to Palia, Melanie represents a powerful femininity. Palia herself advocates a violent femininity, supposedly the only one capable of being truly emancipatory, the reason why Palia fiercely opposes gender studies. We don't have to agree with Palia on everything, but in fact something is happening here, flinging us out of the ordinary discourse, tensions that cannot be contained with a little talk. To understand why the birds attack, we should be aware of true dangers. First, we could answer this banally and suggest the birds to be a find, a riddle lacking any solution. We don't deal with it any longer. The other danger is one of system theory. Systems theory claims meaning is nothing more than complexity reduction. But here, too, we take the easy way out. Isn't it just as convenient to constantly invoke complexity so that we don't have to ask questions about meaning? The question of why the birds attack is perfectly valid. But let's first take a step back and focus on the second major theme in this film. It often doesn't strike you so much the first time you see it: communication, which turns out to be extremely difficult. In the bird story, in the first dialogue scene, it's already laid out. Melanie wants to pick up a bird. It is not there yet, but it should have been there long ago. Wait a bit. It will come. I call. No, you'd better send me the bird. Yes, you can call. I'll wait. No, I can't wait any longer. It's a strange dialogue. And on the top of that, the aforementioned love communication unfolds. In addition, the telephone plays an important role. Melanie phones from the bird shop to find out Mitch's address at the grocer's. She makes a phone call to obtain a boat. Lydia calls the bird feeder. Annie receives a call from Mitch and passes it on to Melanie. Melanie calls her father at the restaurant and he refuses to believe her story. The birds attack Melanie in the phone booth. She barely survives. At some point, the phone line dies in Mitch's house. The mass media is added as a medium of communication, but it does not represent reality. The radio and television reports greatly understate and do not reflect the events. Media behaves similarly to Melanie herself. According to the tabloids, she supposedly bathed naked in a fountain in Rome. Melanie contradicts, "I was dressed and pushed into the fountain." Finally, the post office. At the post office, they don't even know Mitch's daughter's name. Therefore, as we learn from Annie, the mail doesn't arrive at all. Communication proves to be tricky, especially between the sexes, how Melanie and Mitch communicate with each other, Lydia serving as a permanent disruptor of this communication. The most clarity in communication prevails between Melanie and Annie, regarding speaking, but the non-verbal as well. The Bechdel test analyzes whether a film is feminist. Two women must be seen alone in a scene without a man. And they aren't supposed to talk about men. The test is not met here. Annie and Melanie are obviously talking about Mitch, but you can't make it that easy. Aren't Melanie and Annie the perfect couple? Doesn't Mitch represent a mere liaison between the two, and in some ways merely the vehicle for these women to enter their strange game. At least they have a perfect command of the in-betweens, and at the same time they also encounter each other more honestly than Melanie and Mitch. One might suggest The Birds to be a film about misunderstandings and the failure of communication. Interestingly enough, Hitchcock explicitly negotiates the failure of communication. He installs a play within a play here, a short film within a long film. In the second restaurant scene, after the birds attacked the elementary school students, Melanie enters the restaurant, wants to call her father, and an old lady, an ornithologist, appears. Within minutes, a delightful conversation theater unfolds. The script is by Evan Hunter, a masterstroke in timing and dialogue economy. The actors communicate extremely efficiently and tightly. With this film, but explicitly in this play within a play, Hitchcock rejects Jürgen Habermas and all those who believe rational arguments and communicative action solve everything. It's not that simple. We can't even enter a beautiful discourse and consensus forms. Hitchcock exemplifies this in two ways. Dialogue with birds is impossible. The attacks are outside our language. No discourse can take place with them. At the same time, in the seafood restaurant, Hitchcock demonstrates the failure of discourse as the discussion's participants fail to achieve consensus. The positions are too diverse. Too much plurality prevails. The ornithologist sticks to her technical discourse. She uses technical terms to explain why the birds simply cannot attack. Thus, Melanie's experience seems impossible to the old lady. It does not fit into her rational scientific argumentation. Melanie's statement may be empirically proven. We have seen it, but neither the ornithologist nor her father believe her. A drunkard speaks biblically about God's punishment. A religious discourse enters now the film. But a religious discourse is incompatible with a scientific one. In addition, a mother of two demands a safe space, including sensitive language, protecting children from fear. Finally, the bartender's irony remains. A consensus cannot be established here. Habermas and co. have a very idealistic idea of communication, but Hitchcock shows it's an illusion. We are all experiencing aggressive swarms now, but instead of birds, we see swarms on the internet, not interested in rational discourse. But Hitchcock doubted that a rational discourse can really explain everything. He wouldn't have said, like many people on the Bluebird Twitter nowadays, just listen to the science. His movie shows us that positivism is not enough to see the whole picture. Only art can do this. It is interesting that it is the scientist, the old lady, and the press, Melanie's father, who don't not believe Melanie even though there is evidence. With The Birds, a classic is renewing itself once more. Like Bodega Bay back then, our communication channels are perfectly laid out. We have everything at our disposal as they did back then. Telephone, post office, everything. Yet communication on the net fails permanently. We merely end up hearing the robots squawking. Finally, Hitchcock was shaped by the silent film era. He distrusts language. That's why he shows us so much. That's why many scenes exclude speech. Hitchcock includes a lot of silent film elements. The birds only communicate by attacking. By attacking, they enlighten us about the limits of modern communication, our language, and the limits of discourse, so that we don't watch but see. It would be nice if you would like to support the film analysis financially. You can do so via my bank account or PayPal. Also, you can find me on Patreon. Thank you very much.